They were the spoiled sons of the region's wealthiest landowner. Twins infamous for tormenting those who couldn't defend themselves. On that suffocating afternoon in 1858, they selected the most fragile victim, an enslaved mother, exhausted, who could barely stand after laboring in the fields since before dawn. They laughed, pushed her, knocked her to the ground, humiliated her as if she were nothing. What they didn't know was that she had a son, an enormous young man, deaf since birth, who understood the world through vibrations in the earth and his mother's gaze. 3 hours later, as the sun began to set, he saw his mother bloodied and in shock. And there, every limit vanished. The 7-foot-2-inch young man entered the mansion in silence, driven by a mute fury no one had ever witnessed. The wealthy twins never heard their own sentence. They only felt his presence behind the door. And then the terror began. Before we continue this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe and comment "Freedom" so I know who you are. Thank you, and let's continue. The midday heat had transformed the Belmont estate into an open-air furnace. It was August 3, 1858, and the interior of São Paulo was suffering through one of the decade's worst droughts. The cracked earth spat dust with each step, and the air seemed to burn the lungs of anyone who breathed too deeply. Helena walked bent over between the coffee plants, carrying a basket of beans that weighed almost as much as she did. She was 38 but looked 2 decades older. Her calloused hands bled at the fingertips, and her curved back told the story of 20 years breaking her body in the harvest. The Belmont estate had belonged to the Drummond family for 3 generations. Colonel Antonio Drummond was the patriarch, a 62-year-old man whose wealth came from 120 acres of land and more than 300 people held in captivity. He rarely appeared in the fields, preferring to supervise from afar, leaving the dirty work to brutal overseers who managed through fear. But his twin sons, Bernardo and Baltazar, represented the worst of purposeless cruelty. At 24, the two had never worked a single day. They had been raised to inherit everything, to command without question, to exercise absolute power over lives they considered less valuable than livestock. Bernardo was the more vocal, tall, with dark hair combed with imported brilliantine, always wearing expensive clothes that obscenely contrasted with the surrounding misery. He wore a small whip at his waist, not out of necessity, but because he liked how people looked at him when they saw it. Baltazar was quieter but no less cruel. He shared his brother's appearance, they were physically identical. But where Bernardo was theatrical in his violence, Baltazar was calculated. He observed, planned, found people's vulnerabilities, and exploited them with surgical precision. Together, they formed a duo feared by everyone on the estate. They had a habit of choosing random targets for their cruel amusements, a man falsely accused of theft and publicly whipped, a woman forced to work while sick until she collapsed, children separated from their mothers on a whim, just to see the desperation in the eyes of those who loved them. That afternoon, they were bored. They had spent the morning drinking French wine on the veranda of the main house, playing cards, and complaining about the heat. Their father was away on business in Santos, and their mother, Dona Amelia, spent the day locked in her chambers with her maids, ignoring everything beyond her silk curtains. It was Bernardo who saw Helena first. She had stumbled on the uneven ground, spilling half the beans from her basket. She was on her knees, gathering them one by one with trembling hands, knowing she would be punished for the loss. "Look at that, Baltazar," said Bernardo, pointing with his wine glass. Helena messed up again. Baltazar rose from his chair, a slow smile forming on his face. "Let's go see this up close." The two descended from the veranda with the tranquility of those who know no one will question them. Their footsteps raised clouds of dust as they approached Helena, who continued on her knees, pretending not to notice. But she knew. Of course she knew. Everyone on the estate had developed a sixth sense for detecting danger. And the Drummond twins were danger in its purest form. "Helena," Bernardo called, stopping a few steps from her. "How many times have you been told to be careful with the harvest?" She didn't respond, just kept collecting beans, head down. Responding could be interpreted as insolence. Not responding could, too. There was no safe option. "She's ignoring you, brother," said Baltazar, circling Helena like a predator. "I think she's gone deaf. Must run in the family." The reference to Helena's son was intentional and cruel. Balthazar knew exactly what he was doing. Bernardo moved closer, kicking the basket and scattering the rest of the beans across the ground. Now you'll have to gather everything again. It'll take hours, maybe all night. Helena clenched her fists but kept her head down. She had learned over years of suffering that showing anger only made things worse. She had learned to swallow humiliation, to transform pain into something small and hard inside her chest, something she could carry without letting it show. But Bernardo and Balthazar weren't satisfied. "Stand up," ordered Bernardo. Helena obeyed slowly, her legs protesting after hours of work without rest. She measured just over 5 feet 3 inches, too thin, with bones marked under her dark skin. Next to the well-fed, healthy twins, she seemed even more fragile. "You have a son, don't you?" Balthazar asked casually, as if making polite conversation. Helena's heart raced, but she kept her face impassive. "Yes, sir." "What's his name again?" Balthazar looked at his brother with false confusion. "That big one. The deaf one." "Daniel," Helena responded, her voice lower than intended. "Ah, yes. Daniel," Bernardo smiled. "Poor thing. Can't even hear when someone speaks to him. Must be difficult having a son like that." "Defective." The word fell between them like a stone in still water. Helena felt something break inside her, but she forced herself to remain silent. Daniel wasn't defective. He was different, yes, but strong, intelligent, capable of things these two spoiled fools would never comprehend. Daniel was 22 years old and stood 7 feet 2 inches tall. He had been born deaf, the result of a fever Helena had during pregnancy. The first years were difficult. She didn't know how to communicate with him, how to teach him about a world he couldn't hear. But Daniel learned in other ways. He learned to read lips, interpret facial expressions, feel vibrations in the ground that indicated someone approaching. He developed extraordinary spatial awareness and was incredibly strong. Since childhood, he could lift logs grown men couldn't move. He worked at the estate's sawmill, cutting and stacking wood, his strength exploited while his condition was used to justify more miserable wages, even in a system where no one received real wages. But above all, Daniel was kind. He had an enormous heart, helped the weak, carried burdens for the sick, shared his food when someone went hungry. Helena knew her son had inherited from her a kindness the world constantly tried to crush. And now these two demons were using his name as a weapon. "You know what I think?" Bernardo said, taking a step closer. "I think you should be more careful. A woman with a son like that needs to work double to compensate for his defect. Don't you agree?" Helena remained silent, but her eyes began to shine with unshed tears, not from sadness, but from impotent rage. "She's not agreeing," Balthazar observed. "Maybe she needs a lesson." That's when Bernardo pushed Helena. It wasn't hard, just a casual push on the shoulder, but she was exhausted and off balance. She fell backward onto the dry earth, raising a cloud of dust. Pain exploded in her spine, and she stifled a scream. The twins laughed. "Look at that." "She fell again," said Balthazar. "How clumsy." Helena tried to get up, but Bernardo placed his boot on her chest, pushing her back down. It wasn't excessive force, just enough to humiliate, to demonstrate power, to remind her she had no rights, no dignity, was nothing but property. "Stay there," ordered Bernardo, "until we decide if you can get up." Other enslaved people worked nearby, but no one looked. No one could look. Interfering would invite the same violence or worse. This was the cruel reality. Everyone survived by keeping their heads down, protecting themselves as best they could, knowing heroism meant death. Balthazar crouched beside Helena, studying her face as if she were an interesting insect. "You know we can do whatever we want with you, right? My father owns everything here. This land, this plantation, your defective son." "He's not defective." The words came out before Helena could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy and dangerous. Bernardo removed his foot from her chest only to kick her in the ribs. It wasn't hard enough to break bones, but enough to knock the air from her lungs and fill her with pain. "I didn't tell you to speak," Bernardo said, his voice low and threatening. Helena curled up, wrapping her arms around her ribs, trying to breathe through the pain. Tears finally streamed down her face, drawing clean lines in the dust covering her skin. "I don't think she's learned yet," said Baltazar, standing up. "We'll continue the lesson later when we have more time." The two walked away, their laughter echoing through the coffee grove as they returned to the main house. They left Helena lying on the ground, surrounded by scattered coffee beans, each breath hurting, each movement an effort. It took 15 minutes for Helena to sit up. Every movement was agony. She knew she had at least one cracked rib, maybe two. She had been through this before. Violence wasn't new, it was the fabric of daily life. But this time was different, not because of the physical pain, but because they had mentioned Daniel. They had used her son's name as bait, as psychological torture. And Helena knew they wouldn't stop. The Drummond twins were like that. When they found a wound, they kept poking until it tore completely. She needed to warn Daniel. With painful movements, Helena gathered the scattered beans, working through the pain because not working meant worse punishment. The sun continued mercilessly, sweat mixing with tears on her face. It took 2 more hours to complete a task that normally took 30 minutes. When she finally finished, she carried the basket to the storage shed, each step torture, each breath a reminder of the kick. Daniel was in the sawmill, cutting Peroba Roxa boards. The work required immense strength, but he worked with rhythmic efficiency. He didn't hear his mother approaching, but he felt the vibration of her steps on the wooden floor. He turned, a smile beginning to form until he saw her expression. Daniel dropped the saw immediately, running to Helena. His enormous hands gently touched her face, wiping away tears mixed with dust. His dark eyes examined her with intense concern. Helena touched her son's face, forcing a reassuring smile. Then slowly, using the signs they had developed over years, she began to tell him what happened. Daniel's hands closed into fists as she spoke. His body became rigid, muscles tensing. His eyes darkened with a rage Helena rarely saw. He looked toward the main house on top of the hill. Helena saw the intention in his eyes. She grabbed his arm, shaking her head violently. Her fingers squeezed his skin, trying to convey the urgency, the danger. Daniel looked at her, and Helena saw the devastating conflict in his eyes, the gentle boy she had raised warring with the men who needed to protect his mother. Finally, slowly, Daniel nodded. But Helena knew her son. That look meant he wasn't agreeing to let it go. He was just postponing, processing, planning. She pulled his head down, pressing her forehead against his. They stayed like that for a long moment, mother and son, united in suffering, in love, in a world that treated them as less than human but couldn't take their humanity, the capacity to care for each other. When they separated, Helena made one last gesture, a silent request for him to be careful, to stay away from the twins, to survive. Daniel nodded again, but his eyes remained fixed on the main house long after Helena left. The following hours passed in growing tension. Helena tried to work, but the pain made each movement agony. Others noticed, they always noticed when someone was injured because everyone knew they could be next. An older woman named Rosa, who worked in the main house kitchen, brought an herbal compress when the sun began to lower. The master's boys did this, she asked quietly, helping Helena apply the compress. Helena only nodded. "They're getting worse," said Rosa, shaking her head. "Since the colonel started spending more time away, they're doing whatever they want. No one can control them anymore." "I'm afraid for Daniel," Helena admitted, her voice barely audible. Rosa looked at her with compassion and deep understanding. "Daniel is strong, but strength is nothing against." She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Both knew strength was nothing against the law, against guns, against an entire system designed to crush resistance. Meanwhile, in the main house, the twins dined in abundance. Dona Amelia presided in silence, choosing to ignore her son's cruel comments. "That Helena is too weak," said Bernardo. "She fell with just a little push. Barely worth what father paid for her." Her son, though, Baltazar smiled. He could be interesting. Did you see the size of that fellow? Must be over 7 feet tall. And deaf, added Bernardo. No use being big if you're defective. I was thinking, Baltazar said, swirling his wine. It would be interesting to test his limits. See how far a deaf giant can be pushed before he reacts. Bernardo laughed. Are you proposing an experiment? I'm proposing fun, corrected Baltazar. We're bored. Father travels for weeks. We have nothing interesting to do. Why not see what happens when we push someone everyone says is meek as a lamb? He could break you in half, observed Bernardo, his tone excited, not concerned. Then we'd have reason to hang him, Baltazar smiled coldly. Either way, we'd have fun. That's how their minds worked. Human beings were games. Suffering was entertainment. Absolute power generated absolute cruelty. They had never known consequences, never felt real fear, never seen the people they mistreated as anything beyond property. This lack of empathy was about to lead them to a mistake that would change everything. After dinner, as night fell, the twins smoked cigars on the veranda, planning under a sky full of stars. Tomorrow, decided Bernardo. We'll go to the sawmill. We'll have a conversation with Daniel. You think he'll understand? Asked Baltazar. Being deaf and all. He doesn't need to understand words to understand a whip, responded Bernardo, tapping ashes from his cigar. And his mother will understand for him. They laughed, that cruel sound that had become the estate's soundtrack. They didn't know that in the darkness beyond the veranda, someone was watching. Daniel had come to check on his mother again, too worried to concentrate. He stood in the shadows between the trees, watching the 2 young men on the veranda. He couldn't hear them, but he read their lips through the distance and dim lantern light. He read every word, understood every intention, saw in their smiles the same cruelty he had seen in so many white faces throughout his life. And something inside him, something gentle and hopeful his mother had tried to protect, finally broke. Daniel wasn't like the patient men in stories. He was younger, more impulsive. He recognized that kindness in that world was frequently confused with weakness. He stood in the darkness, looking at the 2 men planning to torture him the next day, and for the first time, allowed himself to think about violence, not because he wanted to, but because he recognized some monsters responded to nothing but fear. He needed to decide, would he be a victim, or something they never expected? When Daniel finally moved away, returning to the slave quarters, Helena saw something different in his eyes, a decision made, a line crossed internally. She touched his face, her eyes asking a silent question. Daniel just hugged her carefully, holding her so as not to hurt her injured ribs. In that embrace, Helena felt terror and pride in equal measure. Her son was no longer the gentle boy she had raised. The world had forced him to become something else. The night advanced slowly. Most slept, exhausted. But Daniel remained awake, staring at the thatched ceiling, thinking. He thought about all the times he'd been called defective, useless, less than human. He thought about all the moments he'd seen his mother humiliated. He thought about the system that allowed 2 spoiled young men to torture people for fun without consequences. And he remembered something an older man named Pedro had once told him through gestures: the world will try to make you small. Never let it. Your height isn't just body. It's spirit. And spirit they can't break unless you let them. Daniel wasn't going to let them. When the sun rose on August 4th, Daniel was awake, prepared, and for the first time in his life, truly dangerous. August 4th, 1858, dawned even hotter. The air was thick, loaded with the promise of a storm that never came. People woke early, beginning another day under the merciless sun. Helena could barely move, the pain in her ribs had worsened. Rosa came to help her stand. "You should stay today," she whispered. "You're too injured." But both knew there was no such option. Daniel was already at the sawmill when the sun rose completely. He had arrived before all other workers, unusual for him. He was preparing, organizing tools, studying the space, positioning things in specific ways. To anyone watching, it looked like an efficient worker organizing his area. But Daniel had a plan. The Drummond twins woke late. They ate a leisurely breakfast. Donna Amelia vaguely asked about their plans. "We're going to inspect the sawmill," Bernardo responded with a smile. "Check if the work is being done properly." Baltazar smiled, too. Donna Amelia pretended not to notice the sinister meaning. It was almost 10 a.m. when the twins finally left the main house. They walked slowly, watching people work, making cruel comments, enjoying their absolute power. When they arrived at the sawmill, they found Daniel working alone. The other men had been sent to fix a broken fence, a convenient coincidence the twins didn't question. Daniel didn't hear them enter, but he felt the vibration of their boots. He turned slowly, facing the two men who had hurt his mother. For the first time, the twins really looked at Daniel as a physical presence, and what they saw made them hesitate. Daniel stood 7 feet 2 inches, but it wasn't just the height. It was the width of his shoulders, the thickness of his arms, the hands the size of plates. It was the way he filled the space, how his presence seemed to reduce everything around him. It was his eyes, dark, intense, fixed on them with a quality that made something primitive in their bellies contract. Bernardo recovered first. "So, you're Daniel. The deaf giant everyone talks about." Daniel read his lips perfectly. He didn't respond. "He can't hear you, idiot," said Baltazar, pushing his brother playfully. "You have to speak louder." They laughed. Daniel remained motionless, just watching. "Your mother took a fall yesterday," Bernardo continued, approaching. "She was very clumsy. I hope she learned to be more careful." Daniel read every word. His fists slowly closed. Baltazar noticed. "Look," he understood. "Smarter than he looks. But is he smart enough to know his place?" Bernardo was only a meter away now. "It seems like everyone on this estate is forgetting. Forgetting that we command, that you obey." He extended his hand and poked Daniel's chest with his index finger, a small gesture, physically insignificant but loaded with meaning, challenge, disrespect, assertion of dominance. Daniel looked at the finger against his chest, then back at Bernardo's face. He didn't move. "See," Bernardo said to his brother, smiling. "Meek as a lamb. All that size, and he's good for nothing but cutting wood." That's when they made the fatal mistake. Baltazar approached from the other side, and the two began circling Daniel, studying him like a curious animal, making comments about his size, his deafness, his usefulness. But Daniel understood perfectly. He saw every word, every expression of disdain, every cruel smile. And something in him, the last restraint, finally snapped. It happened so fast the twins barely had time to process. Daniel moved with surprising speed for someone so large. His right hand grabbed Bernardo's throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. His left hand caught Baltazar by the collar, pulling him back with force that nearly took him off his feet. For a moment, the three were frozen, Daniel holding the two men who had tortured his mother, the twins finally feeling real fear for the first time in their privileged lives. Daniel didn't squeeze, didn't hurt, just held them, his eyes moving between their pale faces, seeing the terror being born. He wanted them to feel a fraction of what his mother had felt. Then, slowly, he released them. Bernardo fell to his knees, coughing, hands flying to his throat. Baltazar stumbled backward, eyes wide with shock and rage. You dared touch me!" Bernardo shouted, fear breaking through his words. Daniel just looked at them, expression impassive. He had shown that his gentleness was a choice, not weakness, that his size wasn't just for work, that he could, if he chose, be far more dangerous than anyone imagined. Baltazar perceived the real situation first. "We need to get out of here. Now." They backed toward the door, keeping their eyes on Daniel, expecting an attack. But Daniel just stood there, watching them go. When they emerged into the sunlight, the twins practically ran back to the main house, fine clothes disheveled, pride wounded, fear pulsing in their veins. But fear in men accustomed to absolute power quickly transforms into vengeful fury. "I'm going to have that animal hanged," shouted Bernardo on the veranda, face red with humiliation. "I'll personally put the rope around his neck." Calm down, said Balthazar, thinking more coldly. If we kill him so obviously, it'll raise questions. Father doesn't like losing valuable property without justification. He attacked me. He held you, corrected Balthazar. He didn't squeeze, didn't really hurt. Technically, he could claim he was defending himself if we said we attacked first. And everyone knows we went there to provoke him. Bernardo hated when his brother was right. So what do you suggest? Balthazar thought, eyes narrowing as he elaborated a plan. His mother, Helena. We'll take her. We can do whatever we want with her. Father won't question punishment of a problematic slave. And Daniel will have to watch. He'll have to feel it, but he won't be able to do anything without making things worse. It was pure, calculated cruelty. Bernardo smiled slowly as he understood. You're diabolical, brother. I'm practical, responded Balthazar. Revenge is better served when the victim actually suffers. Killing Daniel would be too quick. Making him watch his mother be destroyed, that's real suffering. They sent for the overseer, a brutal man named Sebastio, who executed punishments without question. They ordered Helena brought to the central courtyard where everyone could see. The news spread like fire. People stopped working, fear running through the community. Everyone knew what it meant, public punishment, made as an example. Rosa ran to the sawmill, old legs protesting. She found Daniel still standing where he had confronted the twins, looking at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. She planted herself in front of him, gesturing wildly until she got his attention. When Daniel focused, Rosa exaggerated the words on her lips, Helena. Courtyard. Now. Punishment. The blood drained from Daniel's face. He understood immediately, consequences for what he had done would fall on his mother. He ran. Daniel crossed the estate in enormous strides, people moving out of his way. He arrived at the central courtyard the moment Sebastio was tying Helena to a punishment post. She was already crying, not from pain yet, but from fear. When she saw Daniel running toward her, her eyes widened in terror, not for herself, but for him. She shook her head violently, gesturing desperately for him to stop. But Daniel didn't stop. The twins watched from the veranda. Look at that, Balthazar smiled. He came to watch. Daniel reached the edge of the courtyard and stopped, fists clenched, entire body trembling with contained fury. He knew any movement would worsen his mother's suffering. Sebastio raised the whip, waiting for the signal. 20 lashes, ordered Bernardo, eyes fixed on Daniel. And I want them hard. The first blow fell, and Helena screamed. The sound tore through the silent air. People flinched. Daniel took a step forward involuntarily but forced himself to stop. The second blow. The third. Each tore another scream, ripped more skin, dripped more blood onto the dirt. Daniel watched every moment. He didn't look away. Tears ran freely, but he remained standing, absolute helplessness pressing against him like a physical weight. At 10 blows, Helena had stopped screaming. She just moaned weakly, body jerking with each impact. Daniel couldn't take it anymore. He began walking toward the circle, ready to stop this, damn the consequences. But then Helena raised her head, found his eyes through tears and pain. And she shook her head, a clear, emphatic denial. No. Don't sacrifice yourself for me. Don't destroy your future. Don't let them kill you. Daniel stopped, torn between every instinct and his mother's silent plea. The blows continued. 15. 18. 20. When it ended, Helena hung from the ropes, unconscious or nearly so. Sebastio untied her, and she collapsed to the ground, a map of bleeding wounds. And remember, Balthazar said loudly enough for everyone to hear, this happens to those who forget their place, and to the families of those who forget their place. Daniel was on his knees, watching his fallen mother, destroyed inside. Rosa and other women ran to help, carefully carrying Helena away. As they passed Daniel, Rosa stopped, her eyes conveying a clear message, this is their fault, not yours. Remember that. Daniel remained kneeling long after everyone left, the sun beating down, dust settling, the world continuing as if nothing terrible had happened. But something had changed fundamentally. The anger he'd felt before was hot, impulsive. This was different, cold, calculated, relentless. He had tried to be kind, tried to be just big enough to defend himself. And his mother had paid the price. He wouldn't try halfway anymore. Either he would accept complete submission, or embrace complete rebellion. And submission was no longer in his heart. Night fell, loaded with tension. Helena was cared for in one of the slave quarters, her back treated with the few available herbs. She drifted in and out of consciousness, feverish and weak. Daniel remained by her side all night, holding her hand, his massive presence occupying the entire small space. In the early hours, Helena finally woke completely. Her eyes found Daniel, and fresh tears streamed down. He gently touched her face, careful not to hurt. Then he formed words slowly with his lips, "I'm sorry. My fault." Helena shook her head with all her strength, gesturing back, her movements weak but emphatic, "No. Theirs. Always theirs." It was a moment of absolute clarity, a recognition that evil wasn't in the victims who defended themselves, but in the systems that made defense necessary. Daniel nodded slowly, something solidifying in his chest, not just rage, but purpose. A terrible, beautiful purpose from finally understanding this wasn't his fault. The blame belonged entirely to those who held the whips. Before Helena closed her eyes, she touched Daniel's face one more time. He saw in her gaze not fear for what he might do, but trust that whatever he chose would come from love, not cruelty, that he would never become what they were. When she finally slept, Daniel carefully extracted his hand and stood. The other women watched with wide eyes. Rosa approached, her weathered face serious. She gestured carefully, "What will you do?" Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then his hands formed words in their sign language, "Justice." Rosa nodded slowly. She didn't ask what that meant. In her 6 decades, she had learned justice wore many faces. And in a world as twisted as theirs, sometimes the face of justice looked like vengeance. "Be careful," she signed back. "The world isn't ready for what you might become." Daniel's response was simple, the world should have thought of that before. He left as the first hints of dawn touched the eastern sky. The estate was still mostly asleep, the exhausted enslaved catching little rest, the white inhabitants sleeping soundly, protected by laws and guns and certainty of their own superiority. Daniel moved through the darkness like a ghost despite his size. He went first to the sawmill, selecting tools, a heavy mallet, rope, long iron nails, a thick canvas tarp. Then he began the walk to the main house. It stood on the hill like a monument to stolen wealth, white walls gleaming in the pre-dawn light, built by enslaved hands for people who would never acknowledge the labor. Daniel had been inside twice. He remembered the layout perfectly. The twins slept in adjacent rooms on the second floor, eastern side. Their windows faced the rising sun, both were known for sleeping late, bodies soft from lives without labor. Daniel studied the house. The household staff would be waking soon, but for perhaps 30 minutes, the house would be at its most vulnerable. He moved closer, bare feet silent on grass. The cellar door was often left unsecured, a lazy oversight by people who never imagined fearing intrusion. It opened with barely a whisper. Daniel descended into darkness, navigating by touch and memory. He paused at the top of the cellar stairs, feeling vibrations. No movement yet. He climbed the servants' stairs to the second floor, each step placed with infinite care. The hallway stretched before him. Bernardo's room was first. Daniel stood outside the door, hand on the handle, allowing one moment of doubt. What he was about to do would change everything, would end his life. Certainly they would hunt him, catch him, kill him brutally as an example. But then he thought of his mother's torn back, her screams, the casual cruelty in their eyes. Men like the Drummond twins never stopped until they were stopped. He opened the door. Bernardo slept peacefully. Daniel moved across the room in 3 silent strides, placing one massive hand over Bernardo's mouth and nose. Bernardo's eyes flew open, wild with terror. Daniel leaned close, making sure he could see his lips. "For my mother." Bernardo thrashed, but it was like a child fighting a mountain. Daniel bound his hands and feet, gagged him with a strip of linen. He left him there and moved to Baltazar's room. The second twin stirred as Daniel entered. His eyes opened just as Daniel's hand clamped over his face. The same terror, the same efficient binding. When both were secured, Daniel carried them one at a time down the servant stairs. They weighed nothing despite their struggles, to the cellar, laying them side by side on the cold dirt floor. He went back upstairs for the canvas tarp and 2 pillows from Bernardo's bed. Back in the cellar, Daniel sat on a crate and looked at his captives in the darkness. He could feel their terror like heat radiating from their bodies. He removed Bernardo's gag. "Please," Bernardo gasped immediately, voice breaking. "Please, we're sorry, we didn't mean." Daniel replaced the gag. He didn't need to hear lies. He removed Baltazar's gag next. "My father will pay anything," Baltazar said, voice shaking but trying for calculated reason. "Any price, freedom, money, we can arrange." Daniel gagged him again. Still lies, still trying to manipulate. He removed both gags one final time and, in the pre-dawn darkness, did something he hadn't done since childhood. He made a sound. Not words, his deaf voice couldn't form them properly, but a sound, crude, a roar, terrible, mournful, part groan, part howl, part question thrown at an unjust universe. Both twins stopped moving, shocked into stillness by this sound from the giant they'd dismissed as defective. Then Daniel stood, towering over them, and made his choice. He didn't kill them. Despite everything, despite the rage and justice and terrible logic that said they deserved death, he didn't kill them. Instead, he tied the canvas tarp over them like a tent, sealing them in darkness. He placed the pillows inside, not as comfort, but to muffle eventual screams. Then he piled heavy sacks of grain and flour around and on top, creating a prison that wouldn't be easily discovered. They would be found eventually, maybe hours, maybe a day later, alive, terrified, humiliated, but alive. In that moment of mercy, or perhaps the cruelest punishment of all, Daniel showed them he was more human than they had ever been, that even with every justification for murder, he chose something else, that their cruelty could not make him cruel, only just. Before he left, he removed the gags one final time. He leaned close to each face, making sure they could see his lips in the thin light, and said 2 words they would carry for the rest of their lives: "Remember this." Then he was gone, back up through the house, out through the cellar door, across the grounds as the sun finally broke the horizon. He returned to the slave quarters to find his mother awake, Rosa helping her sit up despite the pain. When Helena saw Daniel enter, her eyes searched his face for blood, guilt, the weight of having become a killer. Instead, she saw peace. Resolution. The face of a man tested by hell, and walked out still himself. Daniel knelt beside her, took her hand, and signed in their private language, "They're alive. They'll be found. But they'll never forget." Helena's eyes filled with tears, not sorrow, but pride mixed with relief. Her son had stood up, had acted, had found a way to assert his humanity without losing it. What now? She signed back. Daniel's response was simple: "Now we see what becomes of monsters who learn to fear." The twins were found 6 hours later, dehydrated, traumatized, fine clothes soaked with sweat and urine. They couldn't explain what happened, couldn't admit they'd been overpowered so completely by someone they'd called defective. They told their father, when he returned 2 days later, that they'd been attacked by multiple men, an organized revolt. They'd barely escaped with their lives. Colonel Drummond ordered investigations, interrogations, punishments. But no one knew anything because there was nothing to know. Daniel had left no evidence, no witnesses, no trail. And strangely, after that day, the twins never bothered another enslaved person again. They never went near the sawmill. They never spoke Daniel's name. They moved through the estate like ghosts, diminished, their cruel confidence shattered by a single night of helplessness. The others noticed. They understood. Something had changed. Some invisible line had been crossed. And in the way Daniel walked now, still gentle, still kind, but with a new quality of presence that made even armed overseers step aside. They saw proof that dignity could not be taken, only surrendered, and that sometimes, in a world built on violence, the greatest act of rebellion was not to kill your oppressors, but to show them mercy they didn't deserve and could never repay. Helena's back healed slowly, leaving scars that would last a lifetime. But something else healed, too, some wound deeper than physical. Some breaking of spirit that had threatened to destroy them both. Mother and son survived. The system that sought to crush them would continue for years until greater forces tore it down. But in that survival, in that moment when Daniel chose justice over vengeance, mercy over murder, humanity over hatred, in that moment, they had already won the only victory that truly mattered. They had remained themselves. And in the pre-dawn darkness of the Belmont estate cellar, two young men who had thought themselves gods learned a lesson they would carry forever, that true power doesn't come from cruelty or ownership or law. It comes from knowing who you are when everything tries to tell you you're nothing. And that a deaf man of 7 feet 2 inches, born into chains, had more strength in his gentleness than they would ever possess in all their violence. The sun rose on August 5, 1858, and the world, in some small but irreversible way, was different.